everyone. Welcome to our Telecom review webinar on the revolution of rural connectivity in Africa. I'm Ismail Tiber, Senior Manager at PMP Strategy. PMP Strategy is the knowledge partner of Telecom Review. As a consulting firm in TMT space, among others, PMP has an extensive experience working with governments and private operators on connectivity issues in Africa. We have been working for Morocco, Cameroon, Ivory Coast, and other African countries. I'm honored to serve today as the moderator for this webinar, which features a highly distinguished panel of experts. So we have the pleasure to host Mr. John Omo, who is the Secretary General of ATU, African Telecommunication Union, which is the specialized agency of the African Union responsible for promoting the development of telecommunication and ICT in Africa. Prior to his election as the Secretary General of the Union, he worked with the Communication Authority of Kenya. Kenya is ICT regulator, where he provided leadership over the authority's legal matters and strategies. We have also Mr. Omar Maya. Omar, welcome. From Nokia, who is leading the Mobile Network Center of Expertise for Middle East and Africa. We have also Mrs. Maria Gabriela Macra. Welcome, Maria, from Sofrecom. Maria is a socioeconomist specialized in carrying out digital national development plans for many emerging countries, notably in Latin America and also in Africa. And she's also the author of Unlocking Digital Connectivity in Africa. We have also Mr. Dane Dane, welcome. Dane is the CEO of Tablet Comunitario, which developed digital infrastructure for public utilities in remote areas with the concept of reaching the last mile. So welcome again, Dane. And also, and lastly, we have Mrs. Irish Pebrito, who is a senior researcher, member of West African Digital Governance Forum, which is a platform that promotes high-level analysis, experience sharing on the progress and challenges to the digital governance in Western Africa. So our esteemed panelists will share with us their perspective and insights on four main topics. So first, we will discuss the current state and challenges of rural connectivity in Africa. We'll also explore technological and especially sustainable solutions used to bridge the gap and tackle also affordability issues. We'll also discuss the role of governments and international institutions in promoting rural connectivity. And lastly, we'll talk about the social and economic benefits from bringing connectivity in those remote areas. Before we begin, I would like to let you know that you can submit all your questions via Q&A section in the Zoom window. So your questions will be discussed at the end of the webinar, and also that we will be conducting a poll to get your opinions on some key topics. So your participation will be greatly appreciated. Without further ado, let's get started with a welcome note from the Secretary General of ATU, Mr. John. I'll let you the floor.
Thank you very much. Just to confirm once again that you are hearing me.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, moderator. I really appreciate more so seeing faces that are familiar to me and that are working tirelessly to improve connectivity in this continent. Let me begin by expressing how grateful I am to Telecom Review Africa for inviting me to make an opening note and participate as a panelist later on in this virtual panel, which is set to address issues around connectivity, more so rural connectivity in this continent. In spite of tremendous progress that we have registered in the last few years, connectivity challenges still remain an issue in Africa. Approximately 200 million people in Africa live in areas not covered by mobile broadband networks, so making almost half of the total number of unconnected people globally. So Africa has nearly half of the total number of unconnected people globally. Another 800 million people in Africa live in areas covered by mobile broadband network, but are not subscribed to mobile broadband services. And so we are faced with the challenge of ensuring that we in Africa reduce the wide connectivity gap and finally bridge it, more so as leaders in this industry. You are aware that connectivity gaps in Africa are wider in rural areas, which tend to be commercially unviable and therefore obviously victims of low or skewed investment in infrastructure. In addition to poor network coverage, a majority of people who live in rural areas earn incredibly low incomes and therefore are more likely to afford to are more unlikely to afford the internet and its services. Most of them also lack digital literacy and skills, denying them the ability to experience the power of ICTs. The data by GSMA shows that people living in rural areas are more than 54% less likely to use the internet compared to those who live in urban areas. Connectivity is lower amongst women in rural areas whose internet adoption is disproportionately low as compared to men. And that also, goes to the disabled people and the girl child in particular. The ATU is concerned about this state of connectivity gaps in Africa, especially in rural Africa. Particularly, we take note of the usage gap, which far surpasses the connectivity gap. As I have observed, people living in rural areas generally have low incomes compared to those in the urban setups. We continue to engage as ATU, our African countries and governments to make policy and regulatory reforms on the cost of broadband services in order to enhance affordability and universal access to services, ICT services across the continent. But we also continue to encourage partnerships and collaborations with international and regional organizations in order to leverage the potential of joint resources, joint knowledge and expertise, while also enhancing the transfer of best practices and technology. Partnerships have yielded positive results in the development and deployment of ICT infrastructure and consequently enhance connectivity as well as uptake of broadband services in rural areas. And so to achieve rural connectivity in Africa, we are focusing on promoting the development of modern, secure, and interoperable digital infrastructure. 2, prudent spectrum management and utilization. 3, effective allocation of resources, including numbering, addressing, and identification accordingly. And lastly, extension of reliable and affordable broadband connectivity to unconnected rural areas in order to close the mobile broadband usage gap. And so we continue to engage the ATU membership and all stakeholders in these endeavors. I'm glad that we have opportunities such as we are having today in order to broaden the discourse on this particular subject. It is important that we engage in such discourses, and I'm certain that it will facilitate a joint understanding of the challenges and realization of what is needed to be done for the benefit of the people of Africa. And so I look forward, really look forward to the many ideas that we will share in this platform, and more so the implementation of those ideas. Thank you very much for listening. Over to you, moderator.
Many thanks, John, for this very insightful welcome note. Thanks a lot. So I will begin my first question to Irish about notably the current state of connectivity in Africa. So Irish, could you please share with us some complementary statistics to touch more the intensity of the issue and share your opinion also about what could be the main challenges to provide connectivity in rural areas and improve internet adoptions once connectivity is in the place also?
Thank you, Omar. Well, only four countries in Africa have the electronic government development index values above the global average of 0.6102. And the other countries have values significantly lower. So those countries that can meet the world average are Tunisia, Seychelles, Mauritius, and South Africa. In terms of the participation, the world average is 0.4450. Only Rwanda, South Africa, Kenya, Tunisia, and Ghana meet those values. And at the bottom of the list, for example, we have South Sudan with 0. So no e-participation value. In terms of online service index, old average 0.55, Eritrea as 0. And in the bottom of the list, we have Comoros, South Sudan, Guinea-Bissau, and Mauritania. So basically, this is to say that connectivity in Africa is actually a challenge. And those challenges vary from infrastructure, the existence of infrastructure for one side, and the existence of devices, the limited purchasing power of the rural community, so it does not allow the availability of devices, and then the absence of online services as well, the lack of online services delivery. So we can have a highway, we can have a car, but you don't have a store to go shop, you know, so you need to have the convergence of those three components in order to make digital transformation effective in Africa. Thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot. Does anyone wants to complement or to rebound on what just Irish said?
I think maybe I would like to add. Definitely agree with everything Irish mentioned. Okay. I think that at many aspects, the technical part of the implementation is, of course, affecting the business model, right? The business case that operators need to have in order to make some of this rural coverage a reality. Just a couple of quick examples that affect this kind of business case is, of course, I think it was mentioned also by Mr. John Omo about the low mobile penetration, the devices cost. That luckily it's a trend that is going in the right direction. We see devices that are in very, very low cost levels. But one of the main or two of the main technical also challenges that we have in terms of developing rural is the power services in the rural areas, right? Off-grid solutions are definitely the area that is being developed that I think is going to really make a difference on what we were thinking of the rural networks 10 years back to what we can do today. And the other part is the backhauling, the interconnection of the rural sites, which is also a huge technical challenge for that. I think then maybe later we can dive a bit more on these points, Ismail. But yep. I think in general, these are all valid challenges that we are trying to address one way or another.
Okay, thanks, Omar. Just before to move to another topic, I just wanted to, sorry, Aya, you wanted to say something?
Yes.
Yes.
I was going to also say that, of course, power is key. It's more than key. The thing is, let's ask the question if off-grid is enough, because off-grid is giving. It's always the same thing, and it's the big question we ask all the time about rural in Africa: is do we do something to have something? So we do off-grid in a lot of cases. Quite polluting off-grid because it's on fuel. Now there is a lot of evolutions that are done on solar for some reasons that can be explained after, even if solar is more expensive. But why not thinking both? So cross-sectorial deployment, because energy is also needed to charge the telephones, and by the moment, I still think that energy remains more important than telecoms at the beginning for people, or at least the same. And so an integrated view, well, worth to be considered, you know?
Agreed. Thanks, Maria, for your intervention. Yeah, Mr. Dane, please Go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much. I agree with all that Iris said and Mr. Omar, but I also would like to add, even if we have the infrastructure and electricity in place, if we don't have e-government services delivery, I think that the product will not be sustainable and things may not work. I'll give an example of public schools. Okay, any public schools in remote area which are not which they depend on government funds, and they don't generate some type of revenue, and we can see the status now in the remote areas. So I believe in a sustainable model to be also used to complement the infrastructure and electricity. Otherwise, in my experience, it may work, but for a short while. Thank you.
Many thank Mr. Day. I just have a complementary question regarding, again, the current state. We have seen that the pandemic has disrupted various sectors and has also accelerated the progress in some domains. How has the COVID-19 pandemic affected the progress of rural connectivity in Africa? Did we see some changes after that period?
Well, the COVID-19, I think that it showed that connectivity is really needed.
Yeah.
Okay, because we were at the stage where we couldn't move from one place to another, and there is a conclusion that connectivity and infrastructure is really needed on those communities for them to interchange in many ways.
Yeah.
That is my view. Yeah.
Maybe I can add on that, Ismail, that from the point of view on an infrastructure vendor, right? I'm representing Nokia in this panel. We have seen definitely a push on connectivity from the operators, right? However, the type of capex investment kind of changed slightly. So there is always, when we are implementing RAN networks, there is the two decisions of investing in capacity or investing in coverage.
Yeah.
Right? And what we see during the pandemic is that there was a strong investment on capacity, mainly because we had to try to give the services in areas that normally are not necessarily high traffic, right? Like people that is at home already compared to the financial areas that were actually having too much capacity for the amount of traffic that they were handling. So I think that somehow it's positive, as Dan was mentioning, because it has brought the connectivity importance forward, definitely. So that decision has been strengthened with the COVID-19. In practice, though, I have seen that some of the rural or coverage projects that operators could try to start were delayed, right? So somehow, from mindset perspective, it has been positive, but in actual implementation, I kind of perceive that this slowed down a bit during the pandemic, but potentially this can be, of course, improved now that the vision and the need of connectivity has been strengthened so much.
Thanks, Mr. Amar. I don't know if
Yes, I want to add something because Omar talked about business model. Perhaps we're going to deep dive on that later. But this is one of the questions about the business model, because operators do not do the business model the same way. We all know that the business model for rural areas, particularly in Africa, with revenues of like, let's say between there is places at $1 a month, like Niger, Mali, basically places like this. So it's a long run. It's another way of creating revenue. But operators have, let's be extremely summarized, but at least two ways to approach the problem. And this explains a lot of things. One thing is they cover rural to provide continuity without aiming at having positive bottom line on rural, at least short term. Short term means 3 years at least, okay? And other operators do their business plan on the tower. So they consider each tower needs to be profitable. When you do this kind of business plan, you will never be profitable. It's very difficult to be profitable on a tower, on a rural area, in a country with a GDP of $600 a year, okay? So the approach of the operators also make that. In another case, and I think this is quite important, even if we have our friends of Nokia, but perhaps they already know that, they know that very well, is that operators don't like CapEx anymore. They like to externalize CapEx. So what they do is to subcontract the whole thing more and more, not only to tower companies, but also what we call NASCO, which is companies giving light towers with the service and the electricity on either a revenue sharing model, either a margin sharing model. But depending, and here is what everything is related, some operators, which has this business model based on continuity, don't care to give 80% of the margin to the NASCO, okay? Because they're missing on continuity, they're not on the tower. The other operators that they are on the tower, even if there is not their tower anymore, it's the tower of the provider, they are more picky on the way they divide this money. And this raises question on the sustainability, because these companies outside some, like AMN, which is very big, or are quite, some of them are quite small companies, and the projects themselves are projects of, $10 million or euros is not a lot of money in the telecom market, even if it can appear as such in poor markets. So all this business model is moving a lot, in some cases to achieve rural connectivity, in some cases to block rural connectivity, depending on the way you approach your accounts. It's just that, in some cases.
Agreed. We will try to discuss this point more deeply. Mr. John, you have a question.
Thank you very much. I think there are two facets to your question. One is essentially how COVID-19 changed the landscape of connectivity in the continent. And speaking purely from a governmental point of view, I would imagine that we've seen quite a lot of positive changes that were probably not for COVID-19, we would not have seen within the time that we saw it. We saw spectrum that had been kept by regulators being assigned to operators. For example, on a trial, on an emergency basis, in order to improve connectivity. It started as usual from urban areas, and by the time, using one of our governments as an example, Morocco is realizing that the student in Rabat will, at the end of the year, sit the same exam as the student in the rural areas, and you have facilitated, because it's easy to deploy connectivity in Rabat, then you realize, wow, what are we doing? Can we have spectrum for connectivity hastened so that the student in the... So you had a turnaround time where, for example, in certain urban centers, 3 months, there were connectivity to some schools. In the more rural locations, upwards of 6 to 9 months with schools open. So I think to that extent, we saw something positive. The issue is that I think is urgent for us to consider as leaders, essentially, is that if it was possible during COVID times, why can't we consider connectivity as an emergency issue? Because it is, I think. Why is it that swathes of our rural areas still lack connectivity, in spite of the fact that those primary school kids in those locations will sit the same exam as their urban counterparts that are enjoying these services for reasons that they access in? They lack infrastructure, they lack terminals that can facilitate them to be online. And I think the issue of sustainability, profitability then comes in. And I think increasingly we are seeing a trend that for me is a bit worrying in the continent in terms of how universal access service funds are being applied for purposes of connectivity. I think we've had studies in the recent past where we are seeing an increasing capture of universal service funds for reasons that are not related to connectivity, especially facilitating connectivity in the rural areas. A couple of countries have been studied, and we are seeing a worrying trend. I think governments must come out in the open about, because this is money contributed by industry. Governments must come out in the open and ensure that universal access funds, the usage, the governance around the funds and how it's collected, how it's applied, is as transparent to the industry as is possible. And there are known mechanisms for purposes of accessing these funds for facilitating rural connectivity. But on the whole, I think there have been positive aspects of COVID-19 that has seen increased access to services, ICT services in our countries. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. John. Thanks. We talked previously about profitability of investments as a barrier for connectivity. My question will go now to Omar. Omar, could you please share your insights on that issue, and what have been the latest innovation to improve profitability of mobile network deployments? If you can take the lead on that one.
Sure.
Thanks.
Thanks, Ismail. I think there are many aspects. Of course, profitability. Now we're coming back to the topic that Maria was mentioning about the business model, which is the most important part. And there has been a lot of development in the last years. Some of them has been organic development of the cost pieces that we have in a rural solution, but we have also have some kind of new innovations. Some of the areas that have always been affecting this business model has been, of course, as I was mentioning before, the cost of the devices, that they need to be actually accessible to the potential subscribers that have a very low GDP per year, as it was mentioning. So this is actually a trend that is going in the right area. There are vendors like I think Hisense is one of those. There are some of these device providers that are able to give a 4G device between $30, $40, and sometimes even less, right? So with these devices become accessible or more accessible to the subscribers. So these devices is a good area. However, there is another part, and this is the overall infrastructure of that is used in the rural side. Sometimes we keep kind of a relationship. This, of course, varies depending on the type of implementation that we have, the operators are having. But sometimes we try to use kind of a reference. If a macro site, for example, the whole implementation for turnkey have a cost X in the middle of a city, the cost of a rural site should be less than 25% of that, right? We should be, in some cases, even trying to take it below 20%, right? This is just a high-level example, but just to give you guys an idea, because in my experience working, I have been working in Middle East and Africa for now more than 15 years. When we start discussing rural solutions, I could tell you that the difference was not that. At that time, actually, the costs were extremely high. And there are several areas that have contributed to improve this. The fact that the site needs to be off-grid and needs to be potentially be working with fuel, which is something that we're trying to avoid, definitely. And now implementing renewable energy, we see changes on the technologies or small constant improvements on the technologies that are kind of making the business case finally closer to the level that we want them to be. The improvements in terms of solar panels efficiency, the improvements in terms of solar panels cost has also helped a lot in our favor. New technologies in terms of batteries, for example, the number of cycles, the efficiency that batteries of lithium are bringing, even though We can perceive that they are slightly higher in cost at the beginning, but in the longer term, the TCO actually is much better than what we used to have before on the acid batteries. So I think these improvements have organically, we can say, have organically improved the business case of a rural site. However, there is another aspect that I mentioned at the beginning, and this was the one on the satellite connectivity, right? 10, 15 years ago, if we had to connect a rural site, we were using, in some cases, because there was no way to reach it, there was no UE relay, there was not a microwave, or maybe let's call it, there was not a cheap microwave solution that could connect this site, that it could be in a very far area. Now, we used to use, at that time, we used to use geo satellites, geostationary satellites, which are actually satellites that are extremely high, very far away from the planet, that actually contribute with a very high latency, right? So technically, we were actually limited on the throughput, the capacity of the sites that are going to be in rural, and we were talking about the very, very minimal capacity that these sites could have, right? Nowadays, with the years, I can give you a few examples. We have the new satellite networks, the new constellations of LEO satellites, low Earth orbit satellites that actually are at only 600 or 700 kilometers from the surface of the planet, okay? These are moving satellites. These are reducing the latency. So just to put an example that I'm pretty sure everyone has heard about it, Starlink, right? From SpaceX, OneWeb. We have, of course, also discussions with Amazon. They have a product Cooper that is coming very soon. But at the moment, Starlink and OneWeb, we can say they are at commercial levels in Africa. Now, what we perceive with that, with this kind of technology, is that we can backhaul satellites, rural sites, literally everywhere. The bandwidth and the throughput that we are getting with these services is actually quite considerable. Some providers are going to offer 100 megabits per second, some 200 megabits per second. Some are promising in 18 months to have 400 megabits per second. And then we are talking about a rural site that has a proper capacity. And all of this affects, of course, the business model that we were mentioning before, because when we are talking about accessibility of services that are not so niche that it used to be, maybe some of the geo satellite systems, I don't want to mention names, but they could be extremely expensive. They are not there anymore. And all of these factors start contributing at the same time to make the business model of the rural side more of a reality. And I would say, just wanted to add on that topic, that the presence of tower costs in the market also kind of boost this kind of business models, because we're talking about sharing in all the different ways that we can be sharing passive elements on the side with the tower co. We can have active sharing of RAN equipment, which reduces even further the OPEX of the site and the CAPEX as well, of course. So all of these are contributing to have a business model of a site that it can make it profitable in reality. And 100% also, I want to come back to Maria's comment, because Maria's comment was totally right in the sense that this is not a profitability side by side. And this is something that I personally have been discussing with many operators and groups in the region. And definitely rural coverage is a matter of a percentage of the size that you are implementing. There are winners there. There are sites that are going to be more profitable than others. And actually, when we can reduce the cost of each one of these sites, it makes the financial business model more viable. Because sometimes when we are talking, and coming back to the beginning, 20-25% of the cost of a macro site, right? So that means that we can, for one site in the city, we can actually put 5 rural sites. 1 or 2 of those can be profitable. And this is something that it was really not possible. If you were asking me to do this 15 years ago, I could tell you it's not possible that even these small clusters can be profitable, but I think that is changing. Of course, there is a lot of analysis that needs to happen in advance and there are going to be a bit of trial and error, I would say. But the risk that the operator is actually taking is reducing year after year. So I think we are reaching a moment when all of these factors are making rural connectivity a reality, at least in Africa. Yeah.
Thanks, Mr.
And
Rama.
sorry, but we don't have to forget the role played by all development banks in that, because loans done for rural connectivity are longer, and they can be so they are a good partner for this kind of situation. They can address the companies, but they also can address the player of universal service with the grant of the universal service fund. So this is, you know, the thing is, you have to put some money at the beginning, and then there is OpEx. Okay, you have, as Omar said, you put less money than some time ago, and not so long time ago. And this can be facilitated by development banks because it's really in their focus. So, and it's not very big loans, and so it has not to be, you know, short-term profitability. There are mixed solutions that can make it. It's a question of creativity, perhaps, but yes, I agree. And to complete Omar again, okay, the site, there is 2 on 5 sites which are profitable, but there is an externality on the possibility to communicate between all these sites in the whole municipality, for example, and not having cuts. And this traffic exists, you know, and this, I always explain that often in Africa, I'm sorry, that will be, it's quite a joke, but it's not. Sometimes you will have, in some countries, you have like the deployment of 4G in the main roads that go from the, as you know, a lot of African people, even very hard place, like to go to their village in the weekend, and you will have the most used roads have deployments of 4G, for example. Okay, but this is not done on per site. This is done because of the transit of people during the weekend, and it's enough. So, you know, telecoms have to be seen as an ecosystem, and there I go to Dane and saying without application there won't be any motivation to use these telecoms, for example. And I go back to Omar saying that okay, you don't have to see telecoms anymore in any case, and particularly not in coverage of rural areas, as a site problem, but as an ecosystem mobilization. I don't know what you think about that.
Yes, definitely,
I think-
definitely.
Sorry,
There are
go ahead.
just very shortly, Mr. Definitely, Maria, and this is the part of the business model that we really need to calculate completely. You know, there is an amount of development, as Maria mentioned, that is brought on the rural coverage. Sometimes the first thing that comes to our mind is just the subscribers that are close by to that area. There is a lot of transit. There is actually development through education, development even through e-services, as it was mentioned at the beginning by Mr. John Omo. There is a lot of things that happen. It's kind of an ecosystem indeed that actually is gonna create an economy. And the benefits, of course, it comes from the operator, and it goes also for the government. But I wanted to mention also something that when I discussed this topic with some of our operators friends, rural sites are always a good investment. The problem is that some of these are going to take longer time, some of them are going to take shorter time. But if we look at the numbers that I think Erich was mentioning at the beginning on the development of rural areas in the market in Africa, we're going to notice that actually everything is growing and filling very quickly. So it is a huge opportunity, I would say, for all.
Just numeric. Let's be statistic. Telecoms have become, it's not a luxury service anymore. It's a commodity. So the whole business model of connectivity is done on number of people connected. So more people you have connected, more you have a dynamic, and more at the end of the story, your bottom line is good. It's quite mechanic at the end. So Dane, sorry. Dane is trying to talk.
Okay.
Okay.
I'll,
Let me just say one thing in response to the two previous comments. I think the role of partnerships have been mentioned in terms of development banks and USFs, so of monies that are contributed, and that's really both urgent and compelling. There is also the fact that we need to see telecoms as telecom development as an ecosystem. I think the key challenge, especially for rural connectivity in Africa, is what has traditionally been called one of government. Whether you go to Mozambique or Morocco or Senegal or Djibouti, the ministries of government seem to work at variance. So there's no integrated development planning, so that roads is planned as quite separate from power and from water and from telecoms. And what increasingly makes utilities expensive is the fact that we are planning for this separately. And so the need for infrastructure sharing that would bring economies of scale and unit costs down is not just necessary for telecoms, but to ensure that when you are planning for power to a particular region, you are taking into account, or when you are planning for a road network, you are planning as one unit, including telecoms, including power, including other utilities. I think it is something that would increasingly, lower the cost of providing telecoms connectivity in our rural areas, because even in urban areas, you see one infrastructure company digging a trench for a cable one day, the following day, another company is digging pretty much along the same location. And so that's for purposes of sharing is something that we need to ensure that we enforce in the telecoms industry, but also to ensure that integrated development planning vis-a-vis other infrastructure such as telco, such as power, such as roads, such as water is brought to bear for purposes of lowering costs and ensuring that power may become an issue, but when it is planned together with telecoms, with other services, then it becomes less and less of a problem. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. John. Maybe Mr. Day, you want to add something?
yes, I think again, if we could have a business model applied to rural communities, for example, every citizenship needs public services. Every citizenship now needs a digital wallet, which is banking. If we could deploy or offer this type of services to the communities, which they could pay a very small fee on it to have access to it, I think that it could create some type of sustainability, and it could attract more, in fact, those funds available. Because once we put something working and people see that, okay, there's a solution, sustainable solution working, which is creating some type of revenue, at least to maintain the infrastructure there, it could be a way out, in my view, even to attract the operators to put more and more towers in rural communities. That's what I have to add. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Dane. I think, sustainability is something that is more and more claimed by the industry, right? So to what extent, and this question would be addressed to Mr. Amar, to what extent those solutions can be considered as sustainable, and how green energy can be an enabler to achieve the sustainability? Because I think also it's a good, it's an important point to address. Thanks.
I think sustainable from the business perspective, definitely we're moving in that direction. When we are talking about the sustainability overall, there are some aspects that we need to we actually have been studying, with my team. I have a group of experts in Middle East and Africa, and we have been trying to customize some of the type of solutions that we offer to our customers. Definitely, the sustainability, the carbon footprint of a site is huge. The carbon footprint of a site is really huge, right? So what is happening sometimes is that some of these rural sites are kind of low capacity sites that if they get developed, then after some time, they might need to be replaced. They might need to be upgraded. And sometimes what happens is that some of the investment is not fully reusable, okay? So for example, what we are pushing now together with my team in something that we call the Rural Connect, that it's a solution, is that we are trying to have a fully redeployable site, meaning that each one of the rural sites is implemented in one area, right? If for any reason this site grows, hopefully it grows in a short period, and it requires kind of a bigger capacity, all the equipment is scalable. It can be upgraded to a higher capacity, but at the same time, we are considering now part of the heavy infrastructure, like the tower, that should be redeployable, which means towers that don't need concrete. This is what we call concrete-less masts. And they can be, for example, redeployed in a different area, right? In that way, we are actually extending the life of all the solutions, including the ones that have the heavier carbon footprint, which are actually the towers themselves, right? And this can be reused in the future in a different site, previous certain maintenance of that, but it can be reused in the future. So somehow we're trying to bring the concept of circular economy. That is something that in the company we have been focusing a lot in different aspects. So we see that there should be a lot of synergies happening with the deployment that an operator is doing already in the normal network. There should be as much as possible synergies with the rural deployment in terms of equipment. I'm talking about the RAN, I'm talking about the power, I'm talking about even the solar panels. We're talking about all of this. Most of this should be reusable. And even the heavy infrastructure should be redeployable. That way, we can actually reduce the carbon footprint of the sites and also actually make the business model more efficient, because the most reusability of the equipment and even the heavy components of the site is going to be the best or the better for the operators in the long term. So I would say that this is rural solutions is one of those cases where the most sustainable we are, actually it's also the most profitable we can be. So actually there is actually a nice I would say direction in that sense, right? That we are trying to make it as more redeployable as possible, but at the same time we're improving the business case. So I think these aspects are really giving a bit more of a clear or green, even if you want, view to what we can do in rural. And of course, technology, like what I was mentioning on satellite, on the fact that each one of the sites can be redeployed wherever we want in the country, also brings additional value to this in the having sustainability in mind.
If I can add something about sustainability, well, there's two things. Does it last long? So one of the things is when we deploy, we know, because I don't deploy, but when they are deployed light towers in rural, you can choose between 2G, 3G or 2G, 4G. 2G, 3G is not upgradable, very low upgradable at the comparison with 2G, 4G. So even though there is no reason to have, from my point of view, 3G anymore, because it's not such a good, it's better than nothing, but it's going to be discontinued at one moment, and we need more scalable technology in one side. And in the other side, about sustainability in the energy part, there is another thing, which is that, and it's a good thing for Africa, is that operators can compensate their carbon expenditure everywhere in the world. So what do? They do solar in Africa. And I know a lot of cases of that, because it's a way for them to compensate. And it's the case, for example, of Burkina Faso, where companies are deploying solar instead of fuel. So there are some opportunities appearing from the whole ecosystem of the operators in telecom that open to new sustainability solutions. And in the other side, as Mr. Omo said, there are some nice initiatives in the continent, not enough perhaps, but it's good to know, about cross-sectorial deployment between energy and telecom companies. Now, at this moment, Mozambique is doing a study about that with ProEnergia. Ghana did a study on that and on their own funds deployed a national network. And this is growing. There is one company in Kenya which is specialized, called Ketraco, specialized in deploying network, for example, for liquid, and they do both energy and telecom deployment for both. These are small companies, but at the same time, they are flexible companies, so they can adapt themselves easily. And like always, you know, big elephants are heavier. We talk that elephants too, Mr. Romo. They are heavier than small lynx, and that's, you know, innovation is coming from there. I don't know what Omar and the other participants think about, but
No, definitely yes. And the power topic, it's also there is a lot of developments. For example, renewable energy, definitely for off-grid. We're really trying to avoid fuel solutions, but even some of the new developments we have been discussing with some of the suppliers now in the market for Africa. For example, some of you might have heard of the wind power, right? But most of the time, this is linked to actually windmills, right? And what happens with windmills, extremely heavy, they require a very solid structure in order to be able to work, right? And most of the time, especially for the few analysis that we have done in some countries in Africa, it's not possible that it can work as a single source, right? However, there have been new companies, new suppliers that have appeared in the market with new technologies. One of those, for example, is the vertical axis wind power generators that are actually much smaller. They need a way less strong structure and can actually complement with a very low cost level. So for example, this kind of solution are things that we can, and we are actually working on that. We're doing the technical evaluation together with our suppliers to be able to increase the availability of solar panels. Because in practice, also, renewable energies are great, and we see a huge and amazing momentum from technology or from suppliers' perspective, companies that want to work with us. But at the same time, we also see that there are some limitations, right? I can give you an example. We did a great implementation with my team in Cameroon, but we did implementation in the middle of monsoon season. So there was a huge raining stage, and there was no sun for many days. And therefore, at that moment, the solar system reaches the limit and actually can go down. This is, of course, it depends on the level of availability and depends on how expensive we want the site to be. You know, it's always possible to make a site that is going to be, you know, monsoon proof. However, it's not going to be the business case is not going to be clear for an expensive site, right? So we have been doing this analysis, for example, with some of the suppliers to put this kind of this vertical axis wind generators in order to complement the solar power so that we can increase the availability. So no wind power as a single power source, but actually just to complement, increase availability, and of course, improve the business case of the site, right? So there are several aspects that we are, of course, we work with several of our partners, and we see a lot of momentum in Africa on renewable energy, on power systems. And I think that it's for us trying to integrate them, to put them together to make it a reality.
Thank you, Omar. Thank you, Omar. Let's move maybe to another topic, which is related to the government and the international organizations. John, you talked about the role of those of the entities to promote connectivity. Could you share with us some initiatives that have been taken, and what are the main challenges to ensure their success? Because I think that it's not easy.
Thank you very much. I think we've got to appreciate the transboundary nature of this business. We may have national boundaries, but when you're talking of certain aspects of connectivity, it respects no boundaries. And so partnerships between governments and partnerships between organizations is important in this regard. Talking about governments across Africa at the policy level, we have seen not just at our level as the African Telecommunications Union, but at the level of REX, regional economic communities, be it in North Africa, be it in Central, West, South. North Africa sometimes is diverse because not all the countries in that region are in the same economic bloc. But the point is that we've seen a number of these countries, coming together to try to approximate their policy and regulatory regimes as much as possible on account of looking at these destinations as one investment destination, and also realizing that businesses move across the borders. And so for as long as that is the case, their policy and legal regimes need to be approximated as much as possible. Earlier on, Makra talked about the role of banks and financial institutions in implementing, or rather facilitating connectivity. We have seen a number of development banks and financial institutions, coming into the continent, working with either directly with governments or civil society organizations in terms of facilitating rural connectivity. One of the most, I think, in my view, inventive ideas is the idea of community networks, where communities can now access radio spectrum and build a network in a particular community or serving a particular community. And they are allowed by regulators. These are not-for-profit organizations. And we've seen a good number of them coming up in Africa because regulators have been able to give them, spectrum for purposes of establishing small networks within their communities or within their campuses. And then those networks are allowed to interconnect with the national operators. I think it's a great idea that we need to encourage small networks, community networks, where people within especially rural settings or far-flung areas are facilitated to establish their networks for purposes of connecting themselves, talking to each other, but also interconnecting with the national networks. I think it's a really ingenious idea. The other thing, of course, is in the realm of radio spectrum. Increasingly, we are seeing the aspect of rural connectivity in our spectrum policies coming to bear, and regulators, including ourselves as intergovernmental and membership organizations, are working with our governments and the private sector to send the message that you cannot price radio spectrum in an urban setting the way you do it for rural connectivity. And so we've developed guidelines to facilitate spectrum for rural connectivity. And most of our governments are now using these guidelines for purposes of facilitating assignment of radio spectrum for rural connectivity. Lastly is the idea that we must, I can't emphasize this enough, there has to be partnerships between various players in this sector. No single organization, not even governments themselves, can crack the connectivity challenge in the continent. And so there has to be an interplay of various parties involved, government playing their role, the civil society, the private sector, and communities themselves in a sort of a web that will facilitate one big whole as opposed to each and every one of us working in silos, either as governments or international and regional organizations or the private sector or civil society organizations. So we need to play our part. The World Bank estimates in a study conducted 4 years ago that it will probably take us $1 trillion to facilitate connectivity in this continent. And so it requires an interplay of various sectors, government facilitating the policy-making aspect of the business to ensure that one of government is facilitated and that planning is integrated as much as possible. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. John. That's very clear. We understand, according to what you said, that the collaboration between public and private institutions finally is very crucial to achieve greater transformations. Arya, I think according to our discussions, you have conducted many projects funded by governments and international institutions. Sorry. What are your views on how public and private collaboration should be more efficient or more productive? We'll be interested to have your views on that.
PPP together or separately? PPP together. So it's different because a private company can have a loan of a development bank, and that's different. Often in Africa, the public-private comes, the more rural the countries are, the most, in fact, the money comes through the government, but it's coming from an international development source to develop these particular situations. What I can say about the trends now is there is no more grant for anybody, or nearly no, if there is not a component, a social component, which is at least connecting schools or building the government network, because as Dane said, it has been proven in most of the cases, if you remember, but perhaps I'm too old, 10 years ago, all the call for tenders in Africa were saying e-services, e-health, e-education. And then they realized one thing, is very little investors put money directly on, I'm so sorry about that, but on e-education or e-health, but they put money on e-government. And on top of e-government, you can build on the rest of the things. Once you have connected the municipality, you can grow around and you connect the school because it's not very far from the municipality, you know? So it's something you can see. This is the first thing. The second thing is there is no more or very little or quite limited loans that do not consider sustainability. Sustainability in one way or another. Of course, we don't, but for example, for data centers, and there's a lot of data centers for the African continent, particularly in Southern Africa, there are a lot of exigence that were not before. So let's say the conditions now for this to work is a realistic degree of sustainability and the social integration. The other thing is never, ever before, and I say the works, we have to be thankful to the works of Esther Duflo, because her work on development changed a lot of things at the level of the World Bank and even the EIB in the way they look at things. So they look more to the ecosystem as a whole, and when you do projects, they ask you to explain what will be the socio-economical impact and not only the financial impact, which means how much will either employment grow, because unemployment is long-term, so it's not obliged to be like GDP next year, but how much employment will be enhancing quality to how less you are going to manage your carbon emissions, and what are you going to do for children to be more skillful. And this was not in the radar at all 10 years ago. I don't know if Mr. Romo agrees with me because he's very in contact with the World Bank, I suppose, and the EIB and all the other investors. But this is something that changes a lot
Yes.
in the way they approach things, and which opens that when you have a loan, and this is quite important, the time to pay your credit can have a grace time if you show that the economic impact, the broad economic impact on population, I'm not saying financial, I'm saying economic, it's good enough to justify it. And this is a game changer. So my point of view. I don't know what you think.
No, I agree. Actually, on that sense, the social development, the social impact is something that it's really, I would say it's even hard to measure, because there are so many aspects that are affected at once. I can tell you, before my experience in Middle East and Africa, I was working in Latin America. And I have seen the development in few years in areas, in population that can actually reach development just because of the connectivity that you're reaching. In areas where sometimes there was not even fixed lines. Obviously, we're talking about rural areas, not even fixed lines. The only way to communicate was physically, roads, transport, and suddenly the availability of the service for calling, so simple things as calling, data traffic that can open services for the community. Education in the long term definitely is one of the biggest, I would say, biggest contributors, and it should be one of the reasons why we're doing rural connectivity, in my opinion, because education equals development, and that is what can actually bring more value to all the governments. I would say everything that Maria was mentioning are things that sometimes, when we're discussing about the financial business case, the financial business model, is very easy to forget. But I would say that definitely the support of the governments, it is already there. I see a lot of activities from all the governments, but definitely the development and education, in my opinion, is maybe the most important one that we can take in the longer run.
Thanks, Mr. Amar. Mr. Day maybe wants to add something. You're on mute, Mr. Day.
Thank you, Maria, for your words. Yes, I have to agree with you. That's what I was mentioning in the beginning. If we can take e-government service delivery to these communities, I think that we can have a business model which can eventually subsidize e-education, e-health, and all other social services. So it's a combination between commercial and social, in my view. And if we can design and implement that, I think that we have a case of success. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Mr. Dane. Irish, maybe you want to say some words about that topic? You're on mute, right?
Yes, thank you. I'm sorry.
Yeah, okay. Sorry. Irish is a little sick, so
Yes.
okay. No worries. Thanks again for your answers. Dane, this question will be for you because you had a great experience regarding tech evolutions. What are your views on how the governments and international institutions are working to facilitate local tech initiatives, according to your experience?
I did not pick up clearly the question, sorry.
Yeah, sorry. I was saying, according to your experience, what are your views on how the governments and international institutions are working to facilitate local tech initiatives? Because I think that's something you have experienced.
Okay. My experience, it's as Maria said, unfortunately, there's no grants or little grants for e-health and e-education, which we had these 5 years ago, for example. But again, I'm going to insist, through a business model, I think that we can have a case of success. Because as most of the times, the international organizations wants to see the maintenance plan. Imagine that they subsidize for a certain project. What will happen next? This is the key, in my view. They want to see it. How are you going to sustain yourself?
Yeah.
Okay. And one of the things I would like to add on, it's like if government policies could protect the deployment of realistic solutions, I think that we would have more probability of success instead of importing solutions which are being deployed in perhaps first world countries, I would say, or less or not less developed countries. Because when we import solutions and we want to deploy in less developed countries, and most of the times does not work. So if we could have that support from government perspective on implementing real solutions according to our reality, I believe that we would have more chances in capturing those investments, etc., etc.
Yeah, agreed.
Allow me just to say something.
course.
Something after Dane. Of course, I agree with him totally, knowing the sort of work he has done in this area. A very gritty fellow who's worked, against all odds to try to innovate. I think historically, innovation in this continent, especially in the area of ICT by Africans, was initially by trial and error. So you had earlier, apps that came out 20 or so years ago, the likes of M-Pesa. People were just trying. Organizations were just trying whether it would work. Fortunately for governments that were receptive to new ideas, they allowed them to flourish without any regulatory framework. And so you have the bustling financial, mobile money transfer services in the continent, which developed out of to solve the real needs of the continent that had a lot of unbanked, a lot of people outside the financial services, a lot of, very less of credit cards. So that was the earlier sort of. Then, increasingly governments and the international community, financial institutions are recognizing that this is a bustling area. Well, certainly with the need to ensure that the content, governments are increasingly concerned that local content be developed so that people can relate to what they see online in their networks. And so we have virtually all our governments have some sort of a hub where techies and financed, supported by institutions such as banks, hubs where young people can go and try their tech skills. They have funding. Increasingly, most of our governments have funding institutions supporting young people, especially involved in innovation and tech. But certainly there can't be enough. We still see a lot of gaps, such as the sort that Dane has experienced, a lot of less and less of protection, or rather challenging protection of IP rights in a number of our jurisdictions, and young people especially still being taken advantage of. But across the continent, you see a number of innovation challenges where young people can come test their skills. A number of boot camps increasingly supported by civil society, financial institutions, and such like. There certainly can't be enough in a continent such as Africa, but we are seeing increasing positive trends in this area, which I think we need to nurture. We need to have developed in a structured way, because it's also still a bit ad hoc. You have countries that have it. You have, young people still getting out of universities and just trying things, rather than being encouraged to develop this in a structured way. Of course, you have less and less of, as compared to other regions, where there are angels, where there are venture capitalists, there are less of that in Africa as opposed to other regions of the world. So that's also a challenge in this continent. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. John, and Dane also for your interventions. I would like to close discussion, because we are reaching the end, but just to share with our attendees some concrete examples of what has been achieved in terms of in terms of developments, in terms of social benefits and economic benefits. Can we share some examples of countries that have witnessed those types of positive changes? Maybe
no doubt.
Sorry?
I can, Mr. Romo, of course, you have much visibility than me, but I can say Cape Verde.
Okay.
I can say Ghana, who came from, they were like the leader, and they faced a terrible economic situation. And even though they continue developing their network and finding new solutions using their electrical network to deploy in rural, Benin has done a lot of improvements. Namibia in the last 15 years is incredible. Namibia, I had friends that were in Namibia working for development, and they had their own satellite antenna because Namibia was connecting through South Africa on a very small link. And internet was extremely costly. Now they have very good internet, and really a super, it's my point of view, when an extremely rigorous regulator with a very comprehensive usage of universal fund. So there are cases, of course, that have improved significantly. In the case of Cape Verde, they're even doing the 5G strategy by the moment, and doesn't seem to be a political communication thing. It's a real one. So, well, I'm talking about, of course, I'm not talking about Egypt, Nigeria, and South Africa, which are the biggest countries with big discrepancies inside them. But again, the biggest countries in telecoms with still a lot of problems in rural coverage, but very big countries in terms of revenues in telecoms in the continent. No, so I'm talking about the small initiatives of countries with less money and less people, and that could make it, or they're improving really their situation. I of course I say that, but Mr. Romo is much more aware about what is happening in his continent.
No, thank you very much. I think you've said it. Madame Makra. You know, Makra is also the acronym of the Malawian regulator. But
I know, but it's a Greek name. My father was Greek. I'm a fourth Argentinian Greek woman.
But I think that we've witnessed tremendous changes. If you compare where the continent was, for example, financial inclusion alone, more so if you take rural women, the market women, East Africa, for example, Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, Rwanda, Burundi may be a bit of an outlier here, and South Sudan. But if you take the 4 countries that I've mentioned, 84% inclusion, financial inclusion out of, M-Pesa services. And so people that had no bank accounts or, outside the financial sector, 84% now have some form of...
That was revolutionary worldwide.
Really revolutionary. Upwards of 20% internet penetration, usage by the population, again, in East Africa. So you have a very, very well developed financial sector. Of course, there's still, 15 or so percent that are still outside of this, but increasingly getting into it, because COVID again taught us that, you don't need to handle money. You don't need to handle money, and it was discouraged. And so you had more and more people, because of COVID, getting to use M-Pesa services. So the signs are good, and I think the more we can develop the sort of M-Pesa solutions that appeal to the needs of Africa, the better, be it in health, be it in education, the better for us.
Thank you, Mr. John. Does anyone want to add something on what has been just said? Biomar or Dane?
I think I'm aligned with actually all the examples that Maria was mentioning. I think the impact is hard for me because I actually don't get the exact impact at the social level that happens when these implementations are. Unfortunately, from my point of view, there is a bit more limited. I perceive development when I see the volume, the data volume growth in some of these rural sites, and then I know this is economy. I know this is revenues. I would really love to go a bit step further to understand what is it there, but definitely, you know, I think it's a very good and important KPI. And moreover than that, of course, that the development is happening, but at the same time, the sustainability goals of the countries they're actually, you know, being met. We have now, and we see hundreds of sites being deployed on renewable energy, right? That otherwise wouldn't be possible. And I think this is already in the bigger picture is also giving us the possibility of building or making grow a type of business, as we were mentioning before, a kind of profitable business with rural that can actually be hopefully like a snowball that can then start spreading in all Africa. I think that is our dream, and yeah, the same. I have some of these examples in Cameroon, Mali, Ivory Coast, Egypt, Kenya as well. A couple of the bigger players as well there. Madagascar, lots of discussions also there, which is also an interesting market for development of rural services. But yes, aligned with everything that was mentioned.
Okay, great. Thanks, Mr. Amar. So I think that we have covered all the topics that we have initiated. I just wanted to end the discussion with the poll. So it's like a quiz in order to get the opinions of our attendees on some key topics. So I will launch it. It is on the bottom of your screen. We are more than 60%, so it's a good rate. So let's share. Partager les résultats. So I think that now you can see the results on your screen. So for the first question, yes, the measure of answers converge to yes. We believe that improved connectivity can significantly contribute to economic development. So it's a good trend. In terms of technology that holds the most promise for enhancing, yeah, it's mixed opinions. But mobile networks are gaining advantage. So it's good.
We have satellite in the audience.
Yeah. We have satellite, of course, in the mobile network, right? And finally, this is more mixed opinions in terms of primary challenges. So of course, infrastructure limitation is key. Affordability issues also, and regulatory hurdles and policy changes also. So thanks a lot for.
Can you scroll down? I need to see that one.
Sorry.
It's off the screen. Sorry, it's okay then. It's okay.
It's okay. Is it okay?
Number 3. I can't
okay.
see it.
Is it okay now?
Not quite, but anyway, it's okay. It's okay. We can do that. Yeah.
Okay, so thanks again for your valuable contribution. I just wanted to conclude with some elements. So we learned finally that there is a significant investment that have been made by solution providers, government, and also international organizations to bring connectivity to communities. That's very great. However, we also recognize that there is still an extra mile to go. I think in terms of educating people on how to use connectivity and also how to get the benefits from it, and how also making the collaboration between public and private institutions more efficient and more productive. Right, exactly. So I want to thank you all for your participation and all the attendees also, and hope to see you in the in the next webinar.